All right, everyone, welcome back to Talkin' Soccer. I am, of course, Justin Horniker, and today with the World Cup less than, 18 hours away from finally ending as Argentina play France tomorrow, I thought it'd be a good time, a good opportunity before we get back to domestic play to talk about US men's national team and where they might go at the end of the month. There have been some transfer rumors with the transfer window opening up January 1st that have been heating up, and I thought it'd be a nice little practice to kind of go through the US men's national team roster and talk about who has been rumored to move. There are some definites will absolutely move at the window to maybe they'll move to probably not, but there is interest there. So I thought we could kind of tackle it from that point. There aren't a ton of US players that, will probably be on the move. That's an aspect of players being in the club positions that they're in now, and our team being relatively young, with our older players being more stateside outside of Tim Ream, who is absolutely not going to move. He's going to retire, a Fulham guy, if he doesn't come back to SDL City at some point. But all of that aside, let's dive into the definites. The definites, the probables, and the maybe might move. Okay, so first up, we have Christian Pulisic. Christian Pulisic is the one who absolutely, positively will move from Chelsea during this window. I think, as much as Pulisic has said that he's ready to come back to play for Chelsea, I think it is both on Chelsea's good interest, on Graham Potter's interest, and on Christian Pulisic's interest to at least secure a loan move away from Chelsea for the rest of the year and then pursue a transfer out next summer. But all reports seem to indicate that he will be on the move. Now, there are some hangups there, as reported interest from Dortmund, Inter Milan, and AC Milan. Those are some names we're going to hear repeated on this list. But they consider Pulisic's wages to be too high, so he's going to need to take a little bit of a decrease in wages if he wants to move outside of the Premier League. There's also Newcastle and Liverpool who are interested in him, but Chelsea don't necessarily want to deal him within the Prem outside of a short-term loan deal. I think obviously he's a player that Chelsea still see value in, and it's kind of this interesting little dance between we like him, we think he's a good player, but Graham Potter and Tuchel before him don't necessarily see him in their plans. And I think that's because Pulisic's play style, with the kind of role that, Graham Potter and Tuchel have the same exact play style for the most part, and position-wise, not that much difference, formation-wise, not that much difference. So you're looking at a player who just doesn't necessarily fit into the formation, into the style of play that Chelsea are trying to get by. And Christian Pulisic is constantly being played out of position as kind of a winger / wing back, and he operates more as a wide midfielder, or almost more of an attacking midfielder, which for the most part isn't his position at Chelsea. So for the betterment of Christian Pulisic and for the betterment of Chelsea, honestly, to have his wages off the books, to get a transfer fee, probably high transfer fee, and he's made a case for himself at the World Cup with how he's played. Let's kind of dive into those stats a little bit here. You can see just how well he has been. World Cup statistics per 90, shot creating actions per 90, 0.31 expected goals produced, 33 touches in the final third, a fairly successful dribbling rate, 5.43 progressive passes received per game, per 90 minutes anyway. And essentially what that is, how many times he making a run and receiving a pass as progressing the US men's national team down the field. And he also has 4.29 progressive passes per game. That leads the team. So again, progressive passes, when you're completing the passes, is how many times are you passing in a way that's progressing the ball up the field, progressing the play up the field into the final third. Or not into the final third, but eventually into the final third. So I think you can see a player who has kind of used the World Cup as an opportunity to, now obviously World Cup is always going to be a small sample size. That's why you have your James Rodriguez's that can, burst to life at the World Cup, the famous 2014 example. But it is a place for players to kind of come to life in a way they haven't at their domestic clubs. So let's move on for Pulisic. As much as we think that he's a definite, I think the next definite on this list, not just because he has long been rumored to be moving away from Juventus eventually. But given Juventus' current financial situation, where if you're unfamiliar, I plan on doing a longer video on this, so I'm not going to go too deep into this here, but Juventus are in major financial difficulties, essentially because they were caught cooking the books, let's say. They were caught fibbing on their financial statements, and that has put them in a lot of hot water, and also opens up this dialogue that they are in financial trouble, in a player that they could easily sell off, a player who, they like, but he's not necessarily a foundational player for Juventus, as Weston Mckennie. Weston probably gone, Mckennie has been eyed very closely by a lot of teams in Europe, but especially when you kind of look at how Mckennie has been used, he is a player that, coaches have liked during his time at Juventus, but he has always been a player who's been up and down in the hierarchy. He plays well at Juventus, but sometimes he isn't necessarily seen as a foundational player. And I think if you're Juventus, just like Barcelona last year, these teams that are in drastic financial straits, if you have a player that you can get a decent transfer fee from, you can get his wages off the books, that probably helps you, right? And I think Mckennie not only has suitors elsewhere, supposedly being eyed very closely by Chelsea and Tottenham, with Dortmund also having him on their list as a potential Jude Bellingham replacement if Bellingham moves. And I think that is another big key to this, is if Bellingham moves this winter transfer window, you're going to see all three of the MMA midfield being kind of a potential target for Dortmund as well. Juventus view him as more of a luxury than a foundational player. So with that being said, let's dive into Mckennie's stats. He was definitely the US's most important player with progressing the ball forward. He had 5 progressive passes received and 5.67 progressive passes throughout the entirety of the World Cup, per 90. So that is, better than Pulisic in terms of progressive passes, less than Pulisic in terms of passes received, but he was crucial in how the US moved the ball forward. That's why MMA midfield was so good. You had, and all of them will be on this list, spoiler alert, but yeah, Tyler Adams, who was able to kind of anchor everything down and be that guy to retreat backwards and just control the back half of the midfield, while Musa and Mckennie were able to progress the ball forward in a way that wouldn't have been possible without him. Now, Mckennie doesn't always look pretty on the ball, but obviously the underlying stats show you that what he is doing is working, and he's a player without that the US have a ton of issues, and Juventus also have a ton of issues. He's a really quality player through the air as well, a set piece player that US haven't been able to utilize, but on the domestic side in Juventus has been, a definite option for them that any team would be eyeing him for just for that. So finally, in the definite moves, the next one is Sergino Dest. So Sergino Dest on loan at AC Milan. AC Milan want to make that loan move permanent and are willing to kind of pay that transfer fee to make this a permanent move that's baked into the loan agreement. So Sergino Dest over the World Cup at 2.09 shot creating actions, 66.7% tackling percentage per 90, 73 touches, 0.29 assists per 90, and 3.82 progressive passes. As a fullback, he was definitely one of him and Anthony Robinson were so important. I've talked about this in our U.S. men's national team videos in the past, but they were both so important in us progressing the ball forward. And that's going to be a reoccurring thing throughout all of these players that we're talking about today. But Sergino Dest, sounds like FC Barcelona are willing to negotiate. Sounds like AC Milan definitely want to keep him. I think that's a definite move that will happen. Next up, we have our probable moves. And these are moves that could happen, might not happen, but that there is definite interest in the player. It's just a question of, does the team want to move him and does the player want to move? There's not as much incentive to sell with these two players. So first, let's start off with our Yunus Musa. Yunus was a player who had a bit of a coming out party at the World Cup, if not, continuing on from the season he's had. Really, this season has been a coming out party for Musa. He was a player at Valencia last year who had worked his way into the starting lineup, but obviously he's still such a young player, turning 20 during the World Cup, and he has all the upside in the world, and that is seen by who is apparently after him. He seems destined for Premier League play at some point, if not this window, then in the summer. So this is one of those probable moves that Arsenal have already had a bid that were turned down, and Inter Milan have supposedly been inquiring about him as well. So Arsenal actually made a formal bid to Valencia for Yunus Musa, but Valencia don't necessarily want to sell unless that bid gets above their asking price. And I think that's probably in Valencia's best interest. They could hold on for Musa his whole career. They don't have to sell him, but at some point I think the money for a burgeoning superstar is going to be too much to turn down. So that's a probable transfer, if not this window, a definite transfer over the summer, I would say, unless Valencia make a statement that they want to hold on to Yunus Musa, which I think is probably in their best interest. So moving on from Musa, let's move on to Haji Wright. Haji Wright, bit of a controversial figure in terms of USMNT striker pool, but Haji Wright himself had a great World Cup, has been having a great season for Antalyaspor, great season and a half really, has played his way into the USMNT window after, not even be considered at the start of qualifying. So a player who is rising for sure. Another young, promising striker. He's been getting interest from Crystal Palace. It was rumored that Palace are getting ready to make an official bid. And I think while he has been playing well in Antalyaspor, I think that's a club that isn't a career club for a player like Haji Wright. I think he's in a good situation now that you don't necessarily want to move to the first team that offers you a transfer. That's why I don't know if the Crystal Palace move works. I don't think the Crystal Palace move is necessarily a good move for him. He doesn't start right away. He's going to have to work his way into the squad. But like we've talked about in the past, maybe that is the best course of action for someone, especially, still another 4 years or 3.5 years till the next World Cup. If you're thinking of it from a U.S. men's national team side, do you want him going to a spot where he has to work his way into the lineup and potentially not make the lineup? Has Pulisic gotten better for his situation at Chelsea? Or do you want him going somewhere where he's definitely going to be a starter? If you look at Josh Sargent's play with Norwich this year, it's almost better to go to a place where you're going to be a definite starter and kind of work your way into the league. Now, Haji Wright at the time is probably a better player than Josh Sargent. I don't know if that's true always, but, current form-wise and current league-wise, he's playing at a higher level at a higher league. But does he go to Crystal Palace and, have the same struggles that Josh Sargent did with Norwich last season? That's the issue I have. So I don't know if he gets necessarily the quality of possession, the quality of chances that he needs at a Crystal Palace in the Premier League. I don't know. I don't have that answer. Crystal Palace are probably better than I am thinking they are in my head. Obviously, they are. They're a middle table Premier League team, but they're not necessarily known for being a high-scoring Premier League team. So let's move on from Haji Wright then, and let's talk about our slight hopes. These are our players that have been getting a lot of traction, have really cemented themselves as big players this World Cup and this past year as well, but player who has made a move relatively recently and a player who has kind of ingratiated himself into a team and probably doesn't look to move unless it's to the biggest level that wants him. So first player on this list is Tyler Adams, of course, captain of the U.S. men's national team, a player who has had hell of a half season for Leeds as well. And I think that's why I'm not sure if he moves, despite the names that every team in Europe, it sounds like, is after him. But I don't know if he necessarily needs to move from Leeds, first off. And I think he has kind of grown into this role, and he's playing a similar role that we want him to play in the national team as well. I don't know if he necessarily has to leave for Leeds, but the fact that he was bought this summer, he's only played half a season, I don't see Tyler Adams leaving. I don't think he's the player to want to make that move. Once you get settled, you want to take more time to settle in at a different club just because you've been having a good year. I think he's a player that sticks around. Obviously, with his time at New York, with the Red Bulls, with his time with the Red Bulls system in general, I think he probably wants to stay in a similar system. That's why it's interesting. So let's talk about the names that are going after him. Like I said, it seems like every team in Europe, but specifically it sounds like Tottenham have been after him. It sounds like, and that's the thing too. Do you turn down a move? If you're Tyler Adams, you're playing at Leeds, you're thriving at Leeds, do you then jump at an opportunity to work your way in with a team that's a Champions League team? Do you kind of want that Champions League action again? And I think that's the case with the next person as well, which is Anthony Jedi Robinson. Does Jedi Robinson move to a Champions League team? AC Milan are supposedly interested in him. I think that's potentially a good move. And plus you'd have the corners, the fullbacks of Dest and Anthony Robinson on the same team. I think that's good for the national team as well. But Newcastle have also been interested in him. And I don't know if that's a move where there hasn't been a ton of smoke there to begin with. And I think that part of that is because Anthony Robinson still kind of needs to take that next step, but he's also a player who seems to have cemented himself in with Fulham. And I think Fulham is a team, as we've seen in the past with U.S. players especially, that you can just make a career out of being a Fulham great. And that could be a role for Anthony, who has really kind of evolved and bloomed at Fulham. Does he want to then just move to Newcastle? I don't think that's a thing. I think Champions League football is potentially interesting. Like if AC Milan come in, they say you're our starting left back, and we see you as a focal point. I think that could be an enticing move. Play in Serie A, play in the Champions League. Or do you want to stay in the Premier League, work your way in with Fulham, and then eventually move to a bona fide Champions League squad, which Newcastle want to be there, but they're not there yet. And I don't know if you necessarily buy in with that project, especially when you're not sure if you're going to be the starter. Me, as a U.S. men's national team fan, as someone who is interested in the development of these players, I don't know if I want to see anyone move out of a starting position into one where they have to work their way in, especially at this point. Competition is good. Competition for spots is good. But when you're at a high-level club, you're having competition week in, week out. And, at a top-level club, it's not okay for your stat line to suddenly slack off. I think there's always competition at that level. But is it always best for the player? And that's where I often find myself wondering if a move is right for certain players. Anyway, let me know in the comments below where you want to see Weston Mckennie move, where you want to see Christian Pulisic move, and if you think that a move for Tyler Adams or Anthony Robinson is ultimately good for their careers. I want you to let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please give me a thumbs up. It's so appreciated. It's been helping me out. The channel's been growing decently over the past couple of weeks. Obviously, still small potatoes, but I appreciate each and every one of you for watching. And as always, we will talk very, very soon, friends.